Alright, let's go. Number 10. The boomerang carved from a mammoth's tusk. It is 72 centimeters long, curved, flattened along its length, slightly asymmetrical, ground to a smooth finish, with fine parallel striations running down both faces. Wood was sitting right there, light, abundant, easy to shape. Whoever made this ignored it and reached for a mammoth tusk instead. Dense, heavy, prone to cracking unless worked wet, liable to split along the grain if you read it wrong. That choice alone is worth pausing on before anything else about this object. Pavel Valde-Nowak began excavating the cave that produced it in 1985, a shallow limestone chamber above the Białka River in the Polish Carpathians, called Oblazowa, with thin deposits that kept the dig running for the better part of a decade. The tusk object came out of the layer catalogued as Level 8. Replica testing settled what its shape had already suggested. This is a non-returning boomerang, the older, more common form, and the one actually built for killing. The returning kind, the one everyone pictures, is a specialist tool for driving birds into a net, and it's the rarer, later design. A non-returning boomerang is heavier, flatter, faster, and it flies straight, the kind that breaks legs. The surface carries the polish of repeated handling, and the shaping matches a right-handed thrower. This wasn't made and admired, it was used. Then the date moved. In 2025, a team led by Sara Talamo published a new chronology for the site in Pilo S1, built on fresh radiocarbon dates and a Bayesian model of the whole sequence, placing the boomerang between roughly 42,000 and 39,000 years old. Among the oldest objects of its kind anywhere, right at the edge of modern humans spreading into Central Europe. But Level 8 didn't hold just the boomerang. In the same layer, the end of a human left thumb, identified as Homo sapiens, a shell carried an extraordinary distance from any coastline, polished and deliberately incised, a bone bead, 2 pendants cut from Arctic fox canine teeth, antler wedges, and a ring of stones deliberately arranged around a pit. That isn't a discarded toolkit, that's a deposit. The fingerbone's chemical preservation fell outside the range needed for a reliable date of its own. So what we have is only a minimum age and a real physical association. The reason behind it isn't recoverable. We can measure the boomerang's curve, model its flight, read the wear on both faces. What we can't get back is why a used weapon and a piece of someone's hand ended up in the same hole in the ground. Number 9. The VOLGU blades. Number 9. Picture a blade the length of a forearm and roughly the thickness of a phone. 35 centimeters long, 7 to 12 millimeters thick, flint, worked on both faces to a point at each end in the shape knappers call a laurel leaf. Every millimeter of that surface was removed by hand, one controlled flake at a time. At least 15 of these were pulled from the ground at Volgu, in Saulnet-de-Loire, eastern France, in the early 1870s, buried together under about a meter of sediment, published in 1874. Several lost before anyone catalogued them properly. 13 survive today at the Musée Vivant Denon in Chalon-sur-Saône. They belong to the Solutrean, the culture responsible for the finest stonework of the European Ice Age, roughly 25,000 to 21,000 years ago. Solutrean knappers used pressure flaking, pressing a pointed antler or bone tool against the edge until a flake releases, trading a single strike's force for control, thinning a blade in careful stages instead of one blow. The intact Volgu pieces run 23 to 34 centimeters and weigh 128 to 181 grams, thin enough that a single misjudged flake, this late in the process, ends the object and the hours already sunk into it. 2 recent studies show just how far past ordinary craft this went. In 2018, Patrick Schmidt, Ludovic Bello-Gurlit, and Harold Floss tested 7 of the pieces with infrared spectroscopy for signs of heat treatment. Flint, once heated, becomes easier to work, and thin objects like these had long been assumed to need it. None of the 7 showed any heat treatment signature. They were made the hard way, deliberately. In 2022, Sebastian Koch and Patrick Schmidt traced the raw material itself. Every piece analyzed came from flint sources 170 to 250 kilometers away in the southeastern Paris basin. So the sequence runs. Someone walked roughly 200 kilometers for stone, rejected the technique that would have made it easier to shape, and then thinned each nodule to under a centimeter across a 30-centimeter span, knowing exactly how little margin for error that left. No use-wear study of the Volgu pieces has been published, so anything said about their function is interpretation, not evidence. But no obvious use traces have been reported. The edges are too thin to resharpen, and working Solutrean laurel leaves generally run under 15 centimeters. These are 2 to 3 times that. A hunting point doesn't need to be a forearm long, and it gains nothing from being thin enough to snap under its own weight. The likelier reading: weapons in outline, something else in purpose. Skill turned into an object you could carry and show. Then the whole set was buried together, deliberately and left. The craft is completely legible. What it was for is not. Number 8. The oldest HAFTED spear tip. Number 8. Push a piece of human technology back by roughly 200,000 years, and the case ends up resting on scratches a few millimeters wide. The technology is hafting, fixing a stone point to a shaft, and the claim comes from Kathu Pan 1, a site in South Africa's Northern Cape. The layer in question, stratum 4A, has been dated 2 independent ways. Optically stimulated luminescence puts it around 460,000 years old. Uranium series and electron spin resonance on an extinct horse's tooth puts it above 500,000. Both carry wide margins of error, openly acknowledged by the researchers. Together they place the deposit somewhere near 500,000 years old, long before our own species existed anywhere on Earth. In 2012, Jane Wilkins, then at the University of Toronto, published the case for that layer in Science. Her team examined 210 stone points from it, looking for a specific kind of damage. The fracture pattern a point picks up when driven into an animal at speed, distinct from the damage a cutting edge accumulates. 29 of the 210, just under 14%, carried it, clustered at the tips. About 13% also showed the kind of base modification used to seat a point in a shaft. The team calibrated their criteria against points fired from a crossbow and against unused flakes, where the same damage showed up on fewer than 2%. Fracture analysis is exactly the kind of evidence specialists spend careers picking apart, and this one didn't go unchallenged. In 2014, a direct rebuttal argued that Kathu Pan fractures don't begin the way genuine impact damage begins, and read more like ordinary napping scars. A single fracture type isn't enough to diagnose a weapon, and the base modification doesn't require a half to explain it. Wilkins and colleagues answered the following year without backing down, and in 2016 modeled the assemblage as roughly half genuine impact damage, half natural post-burial wear, arguing the natural component alone couldn't produce the pattern seen. The argument is still open. What isn't in dispute is what a hafted point actually requires. It isn't a sharper rock, it's an assembly, a shaped stone component, a separately prepared wooden shaft, and adhesive to bond them, usually a binding of sinew or plant fiber to hold the joint under load. Each part comes from a different process, a different material, a different timescale, and none of them does anything alone. Later African adhesive recipes make the demand explicit. Compound mixtures of resin with ochre or beeswax, heated to a working consistency, and given exactly one chance to set before the joint takes a load. Building that object means holding the finished weapon in mind while shaping a piece that, on its own, does nothing. That idea is the root of every composite technology since. Arrows and axes and machines built from parts that are useless in isolation. What's left at Kathu Pan is 210 stone points, a careful, unresolved argument about 29 of them, and no shaft, no glue, no binding anywhere in the deposit, because none of those things survive 500,000 years. Number 7. The spear thrower. Number 7. 2 fragments of worked reindeer antler, one recorded in place, the other turning up in the screening, from the same square meter of a cave floor in the Dordogne called Combe Saunière, excavated under Jean-Michel Geneste in 1986. They refit into a single small object, 50, 5 millimeters long, 7, 5 millimeters wide, just over 9 millimeters high, ending in a hook. Pierre Catalan published it in 1989 from a level dated between roughly 19,000 and 17,000 years ago, the oldest object anywhere that can be confidently identified as part of a spear thrower. The device is a lever, not a weapon in itself. A rigid shaft about half a meter long ends in a hook or spur. The butt of a light spear rests against it. The throwing arm comes forward, the wrist rotates, and the hook travels through its arc far faster than the hand holding it. So the spear leaves at the speed of the hook, not the hand. John Whitaker, who has spent decades studying and throwing these things, puts it plainly. Levers, not springs. The numbers back him up, and they also correct a myth. In 2023, Michelle Beber and colleagues published an experiment in Scientific Reports covering 108 participants and 2,160 recorded throws. Hand-thrown javelins average 9.8 meters per second. The same people using a spear thrower and dart averaged 16.2, roughly 65% faster, not the triple the speed figure that circulates constantly and isn't true. A separate study of 414 throws by experienced atlasts measured by radar put typical dart speeds around 22 meters per second, with the best throws reaching the mid-30s. The more interesting result sat inside the Beber data. In the hand-thrown javelin trials, men threw significantly faster than women, the expected outcome. In the spear thrower trials, that gap disappeared. Once the lever is doing the work, raw arm strength stops being the limiting factor, and timing takes over instead. For a band of 40 people at the edge of an ice sheet, that's not a small detail. A hand-thrown spear is a weapon for whoever has the shoulders for it, which in any group is a minority. A spear thrower is a weapon almost anyone can learn to release well. It doesn't make one hunter better, it changes how many people in a camp can hunt at all. Only about 115 Paleolithic spear throwers are known worldwide. A strange scarcity for something clearly in wide use, but it's a preservation accident. Antler survives. The half-meter wooden shaft it was fitted to almost never does. The earliest examples, this one included, are plain splinters with a scraped notch. The famous carved pieces, bison, leaping fawns, mammoths, come later, once the machine had already proved itself and was worth decorating. The design never left. Spanish soldiers met the Atlatl and Aztec hands in the 16th century, and it was still killing them. Australia's woomera is still made and used. People compete with these weapons today, on ranges, with radar guns pointed down the line at a piece of Ice Age engineering that never stopped working. Number 6. The quiver that wasn't ready. Number 6. 14 arrows in a deer hide quiver, stiffened along one side by a hazel rod. 2 of them could actually be shot. The other 12 were bare shafts of wayfaring tree wood, stripped of bark but not smoothed, with no point and no feathers. The bow beside the quiver, U1, 82 meters, longer than the man carrying it, wasn't finished either. The stave still needed working down. A separate bundle held 2 meters of cord twisted from 3 strands of animal sinew, about 4 millimeters thick, the oldest bowstring known anywhere. It wasn't strung on the bow. The man is the Iceman, found in the Ötztal Alps, dead about 5,300 years. The most complete Stone Age weapon kit that exists, and what makes it worth close reading isn't its age. It's the specification visible in it. The fletching on the 2 finished arrows is 3 split feather halves set around the shaft, fixed with birch tar and bound with nettle fiber thread, the earliest surviving fletching in the world, and the layout is essentially what archers still use. One arrow has a 2-part shaft, with a short dogwood foreshaft socketed into the main one, the earliest known example of that design, and the logic is economic. The foreshaft takes the impact and the breakage, and can be swapped out without rebuilding the whole arrow. The rest of the kit matches that level of intent, a copper axe with a blade cast at 99.7% purity on a U-haft bound with birch tar and leather, a small flint dagger with an ash handle and a woven sheath, a 12 centimeters lime wood retoucher, sharpened like a pencil with a hard antler point driven into its core, made for pressing a flint edge back to sharpness in the field. None of it is improvised. Almost none of it was ready. In 2001, radiologist Paul Gostner, working in Bolzano, spotted something on a scan that more than 100 earlier examinations had missed: a flint arrowhead lodged in the left shoulder, entering from behind and below. He'd been shot from the rear. For nearly 20 years, the standard reading, published in 2007, held that the arrow tore the artery under the collarbone and killed him fast. In November 2025, a clinical reassessment from URAC Research in Bolzano complicated that. The wound track runs 11 to 13 centimeters, mostly through muscle, at a shallow upward angle, and the point came to rest about a centimeter from the major vessels rather than through them. Their reading: he likely didn't bleed out quickly. He may have lasted hours, which turns this from an execution into something slower, colder, and far less certain on a mountain pass at 3,000 meters. There's a second injury too, a deep, unhealed cut to the bone at the base of his right thumb, several days old at death. Something had already happened to him before the arrow found him. The bow sits in a museum case in Bolzano now, still unfinished, still too long for him, the last piece of work he never got to complete. And one detail from that morning has never been explained at all. The copper axe, worth more than everything else on that mountain combined, was still lying beside the body when the ice let him go. Number 5. The point designed to fail. Number 5. The Clovis point is the most recognizable stone tool in North America, a lance-shaped blade, usually 5 to 12 centimeters long, made across the continent around 13,000 years ago, and it carries one feature nobody has ever fully explained. From the base of each face, a long channel flake was struck upward, leaving a groove running a third of the way up the blade. Knappers call it the flute, and by any structural logic, it's a bad idea. It strips material from the strongest part of the point, and the strike that produces it can shatter the whole piece at the very last stage of work, after every prior hour is already sunk into it. Modern knappers reproducing the technique still lose a share of their pieces at exactly that moment. Since Clovis points were first recognized in the 1930s, the standard answers, better hafting, faster bleeding, have never quite satisfied anyone. In August 2024, Scott Byram, Kent Lightfoot, and Jun Sunseri at UC Berkeley proposed something different in PLOS1. What if the point wasn't primarily thrown or thrust at all? Their model is a braced pike, the shaft's butt planted in the ground, the point angled upward, and the weapon never driven at the animal. The animal drives itself onto it. That's not an exotic hunting method. It's how people have taken bears, boar, and big cats on several continents for centuries, and arguably the only realistic way for someone on foot to face something mammoth-sized and live. The team built a drop tower to measure what a braced Clovis assembly actually does under load. A sharp point needs only 4 to 8 joules to punch through hide. The lashings binding the point to its foreshaft fail somewhere between 27 and 62 joules, clustering around 39 to 49. Past roughly 62 joules, the stone itself starts to crush. A charging animal delivers far more energy than any of those numbers. Thousands of joules from a large animal at a run, several times that from something mammoth-sized. The arithmetic isn't close. Something in the assembly is always going to break. The only real question is which part fails first and in what order. That's where the design earns its intelligence. The foreshaft, a beveled rod of bone or ivory, collapses in a controlled way under compression, letting the stone point recede into the wound instead of exploding under full load, while the heavier wooden shaft keeps driving forward behind it. The bone rod may then rotate outward, widening the wound as it goes. That's a deliberately engineered failure sequence. The expensive component goes last, the cheap one goes first. The same principle as a fuse in a circuit. Reed is a hand weapon, the flute is a manufacturing risk with no obvious payoff. Reed is part of a braced system. It's a seat, a thinned base that lets the point slide back rather than shatter against bone. The authors are careful about the limits of their own tests. Static, single axis, no modeling of a moving or angling animal. This is a strong hypothesis, not a settled one, and fluting arguments have swallowed better ideas before it. But it reframes the object entirely. No human arm generates enough force to matter against something 4 tons heavier than the hunter holding the spear. The only usable force is the animal's own, and the only way to harness it is to stand still and let it arrive. Ask a modern hunter of dangerous game about a crossbar welded to a boar spear, and you get the same answer. It's there because the animal keeps coming after the blade is already in it. 13,000 years later, the physics of holding ground against something that outweighs you hasn't moved at all. Number 4. The machine that left no trace. Number 4. Here's an awkward fact to sit with before the evidence arrives. The bow may be the single most consequential weapon of the Stone Age. It made killing possible at range, silently, repeatedly, and it eventually reorganized both hunting and war. And there is no surviving bow anywhere on Earth older than about 11,000 years. Wood, sinew, and gut rot. So almost the entire early history of the weapon has to be read off the one part that doesn't: the tip. The strongest case comes from Sibutu Cave in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, in layers dated by luminescence to roughly 61,000 to 65,000 years ago. What survives there are small-backed quartz pieces. One illustrated example measures just 12 by 8 millimeters, and Marley's Lombard's residue analysis found something specific about how they were mounted. The plant gum adhesive is concentrated from the middle of the piece toward the blunt edge, and the resin preserves the imprint of the plant fibers used to bind it, a pattern consistent only with the stone glued sideways, cutting edge forward, rather than pointed forward the way a spear tip would be. A sideways mounted edge is useless on anything driven by the arm alone. It only makes sense as a light cutting head on a small, fast projectile. A 2018 paper by Lucinda Backwell, Francesco Giurico, and colleagues added a bone point from the same cave and roughly the same age, 49 millimeters long, 5 millimeters wide, carrying impact fractures with internal microcracks confirmed under high-resolution scanning, and a comparable point from Classy's River on the southern coast, with adhesive residue and hafting traces within 9 millimeters of its base. But the Classy's River team stated the field's real limit plainly. No published method reliably distinguishes a hand-thrown javelin tip from an arrowhead. Everything before 11,000 years ago is an argument from size, mounting, and damage pattern, not a bow sitting in a case. There's a second line of reasoning that works on the whole system rather than the tip. A bow isn't one invention, it's at least 6. An elastic stave from the right wood, a string that won't stretch, a light shaft, a tip, an adhesive, a binding, each developed separately, none of them useful alone. What we recover is the last and smallest component of that system, and the only one that fossilizes. The argument now spans continents. At Fa Lena Cave in Sri Lanka, Michelle Langley and colleagues published 130 bone points in 2020, the earliest around 48,000 years old, from a rainforest where the prey was monkeys and squirrels, though other researchers note the same points could just as easily tip a multi-pronged fishing spear. At Grotte Mondrian in France, flint points weighing only a few grams have been argued as evidence for archery in Europe 54,000 years ago. And the objects everyone actually wants are almost entirely gone. Alfred Rust excavated more than 100 pine arrow shafts, complete with bowstring notches, from Stellmore near Hamburg in the mid-1930s, nearly all of them destroyed in a single night. In an Allied air raid on Kiel in May 1944, a set of arrows that had survived 11,000 years in waterlogged ground, erased by a 20th century war. 2 fragments resurfaced in Rust's own papers in 2013, and were dated to just under 12,000 years old. The oldest complete bows, cut from elm, from a Danish bog at Holmgard, are about 9,000 years old. That's the entire surviving physical record of prehistory's most important weapon: 100 burnt arrows, 2 survivors in an envelope, and some bog-stained elm in Copenhagen. If the Sibutu reading holds, the bow existed for 50,000 years before anything we can hold in a hand. We know it mostly by the size of the stones it left behind. Number 3. The poison. Number 3. A poisoned arrow doesn't need to kill on impact. It only needs to deliver something that will, which means the smallest, least lethal looking point in the archaeological record may be the deadliest one in the kit. Stone Age projectile tips shrink over time in a measurable trend, and comparison with recorded hunting practice shows the smallest of all belong consistently to poisoned arrows. A point barely a centimeter wide won't drop a large animal on its own. At that size, the arrow has stopped being the weapon, it's the delivery system. Proving that chemically took decades, because the compounds involved were assumed not to survive. In 2026, a team led by Sven Isaksson at Stockholm University, working with Marlies Lombard and Anders Hagberg, closed the argument in Science Advances. Gas chromatography and mass spectrometry on 10 small quartz tools from Umhlutuzana rock shelter in KwaZulu-Natal turned up bufadienolide and epibufadienolide, alkaloids from a single plant, Buphonedestica, the poison bulb, on 5 of them, in deposits roughly 6. It's the oldest direct chemical evidence of arrow poison anywhere on Earth, and the team validated their method first by running it on historic Swedish arrowheads about 250 years old, and finding the same compounds still present. The path here was a string of near misses. In 2012, Francesco De Rico, Lucinda Backwell, and colleagues published a thin wooden applicator stick from Border Cave, South Africa, about 24,000 years old, carrying residue of ricinoleic acid from the castor bean, read as a poison applicator and challenged within months, since ricinoleic acid is also the main component of ordinary castor oil, used medicinally and cosmetically. The authors held their ground on the stick's shape and context. Neither side could fully close the case. What made the next find different was that it came with an actual recipe. In 2024, Justin Bradfield, Ian Dewberry, and Paul Steenkamp at the University of Johannesburg analyzed an antelope femur that had sat uncatalogued in a university collection for roughly 40 years, from Kruger Cave in the Magaliesberg, about 7,000 years old, with 3 bone arrowheads pushed into the marrow cavity, which had functioned as a sealed container. Inside, digitoxin and strophanthinidin, 2 different cardiac glycosides, plus ricinoleic acid again, a mixture, not a single crushed leaf, from plants that don't grow anywhere near that cave. Someone traveled a long way for those ingredients, or traded with people who had. Worth knowing exactly what these compounds do, because it explains the patience the whole system demands. Cardiac glycosides jam the ion pump that heart cells rely on to reset themselves. Calcium accumulates in the muscle. The rhythm degrades into an arrhythmia the heart can't recover from. Ricin works differently and more slowly, shutting down protein synthesis inside cells so thoroughly that death follows only after many hours. Even at a high dose, neither compound acts fast. 20th century southern African hunting records describe a large animal taking 12 to 15 hours to go down after a poisoned hit, tracked for days and finished with a spear at the end. The weapon, in other words, was never just the arrow. It was the arrow, plus a compound drawn from one specific plant, plus the knowledge of which plant, plus a mixture proven to outperform any single ingredient, plus days of tracking sustained purely on confidence in the chemistry. That last part is the quietly unsettling half of this entry, and it has nothing to do with cruelty. It's that the entire system only functions if cause and effect can be held together across a gap of days, on faith in a compound you can't see working. It never really left. Cardiac glycosides are still in modern medicine. The same class of compound that stops a wounded antelope's heart is used, at a controlled dose, to steady a failing human one. The molecules haven't changed at all. The only thing separating the two uses is quantity and intent, which is a strange thing to be able to say about a 60,000-year-old technology. Number 2, the weapons that stayed in the bodies. Number 2, more than 60 people, buried deliberately in a defined cemetery on a low sandstone rise above the Nile, with stone flakes scattered through the bones that had no obvious reason to be there. Fred Wendorf excavated the site catalogued as Site 117 near Jebel Sahaba in northern Sudan in 1965, racing the rising water behind the new Aswan High Dam. He published his conclusion in 1968, the earliest known evidence of warfare, a label the site has carried ever since. The bones went to the British Museum in 2001 and sat there, available until 2021, when Isabelle Crevecoeur, Daniel Antoine, and colleagues ran a full microscopic reanalysis of all 61 individuals and published it in scientific reports. They found over 100 injuries nobody had recorded before. 62% of the cemetery carried trauma of some kind. 11 people still had stone fragments lodged in their bones alongside projectile marks. 20 embedded pieces counted in total, 13 of them never previously noticed. The finding that changes what this site actually means. Many of the injured carried healed wounds and fresh, unhealed ones on the same skeleton at the same time. Old damage the body had recovered from, sitting next to new damage from the day they died. A battle happens once. Healed injuries mean these people were attacked, survived, kept living, and were attacked again. And the pattern holds across men, women, and children in roughly equal measure, which isn't the profile of warriors fighting a war. It's the profile of raiding, repeated across generations, against a group with nowhere left to go. The dates span roughly 13,000 to 18,000 years ago, when the Nile corridor was the only reliable water source in an increasingly hostile, drying landscape, desert on both sides, the valley narrowing. There wasn't anywhere else for a family to walk to. The embedded fragments themselves aren't finely made arrowheads. Many are ordinary, unretouched flakes, set as barbs and lateral cutting edges alongside pieces worked to an oblique or transverse edge. Composite weapons built from several small stone inserts, with enough size variation to suggest more than one kind of weapon, from light arrows up to something considerably heavier. A row of loose flakes along a shaft doesn't make a clean hole. It makes a wound that tears on the way in and leaves pieces behind when the shaft is pulled free or snaps. Some of the inserts were never even retouched. Struck once, used, and set into a shaft nobody expected to recover. The design intent wasn't a fast kill. It was damage that stays, and we can see that intent clearly today, only because it worked exactly as built. These weapons come apart inside a person, and they did. The same picture turns up in East Africa. At Nataruk, on an old shoreline of Lake Turkana in Kenya, Marta Mirazan Lar and colleagues published 27 individuals in 2016, around 10,000 years old, lying unburied where they fell, one man's skull with an obsidian blade still lodged inside it. The finding drew a serious, detailed challenge in print. Even the critics accepted the blade itself. Obsidian is uncommon in that stretch of the Turkana Basin, which quietly suggests the weapon traveled from somewhere else. The Jebel Sahaba remains sit in drawers in London now, catalogued to a standard Wendorf couldn't have reached in 1965, stone fragments still inside some of them. Nobody knows what these people called themselves, what the fighting was actually about, who came out ahead, or whether it meant anything past that season. Number 1. The spears from the lignite mine. Number 1. 9 spears, 1 lance, 6 double-pointed throwing sticks, and more than 12,000 animal bones scattered around them, including the remains of over 50 horses, many carrying cut marks. Wood this old should not exist anywhere. Every other organic trace from this period is gone. It survived here for one reason. The shoreline it was thrown onto sealed it into waterlogged, oxygen-starved sediment within days and kept it that way ever since. Hartmut Team's team began digging along that old lake edge in 1994 at an open-cast lignite mine in Schoningen, Lower Saxony, an excavation that ran 5 years and produced the oldest complete set of hunting weapons on Earth. The spears run 1:84:2, 53 meters long, 29 to 47 millimeters thick, mostly Norway spruce, one of pine, and they aren't sharpened sticks. On at least some of them, the point of greatest diameter, the center of gravity, sits in the front third of the shaft, the balance profile of a competition javelin, built to fly nose first instead of tumbling. The points themselves were cut from the densest wood at the base of the trunk, and the shaft was worked so the tree's soft, central pith runs off to one side of the tip rather than straight through it. Someone understood a spruce isn't uniform wood, and knew which part of one specific tree had to become the part that hits bone and holds. That wood was carried 3 to 5 kilometers to the lake. A 2024 study counted 187 worked wooden objects at the site altogether, 20 to 25 weapons, roughly 35 domestic tools for hideworking. This wasn't improvisation on a shoreline, it was a workshop with a supply chain. In 2019, Annemiek Milks, David Parker, and Matt Pope tested what the design actually does. Replicas of Schoningen Spear 2, built in Norwegian spruce at 760 and 800 grams, were handed to 6 trained javelin athletes. The spears reached 19 to 31 meters, with aimed throws hitting targets out to 20 meters at 13.5 to nearly 22 meters per second, carrying 71 to 179 joules. That forced a real revision. The accepted effective range had been 5 to 10 meters, essentially thrusting distance. The measured figure is 15 to 20 meters, the difference between standing beside a horse and standing well clear of it. 2 of the throwing sticks tell the same story of deliberate selection. 1, spruce, 264 grams, carries impact fractures matching experimental throwing sticks. The other, 77 centimeters and about 140 grams, has growth rings averaging just 0.2 millimeters. A tree chosen specifically for growing slowly into extremely dense wood, bark stripped, surface scraped smooth, knots worked flush, both ends tapered by hand. Then, in May 2025, the ground shifted under the whole find. For 30 years these were the 400,000-year-old spears, later revised down to around 300,000. A team including researchers from the Leibniz Center for Archaeology in Mainz and Kirsty Pinkman at the University of York applied amino acid geochronology to protein trapped in the shells of freshwater snails from the same layers, and got a new figure, roughly 200,000 years old. Not everyone is convinced. Thomas Terberger, who has worked the site for years, calls the argument interesting, but not yet settled. If the new date holds, though, it moves Schoningen out of the time frame of an earlier human species and into the range of the Neanderthals, handing this entire arsenal to the population that spent a century and a half being described as the crude branch of the family tree. There's a strange symmetry in that, and it can't be checked against the obvious evidence, because there are no human bones at Schoningen at all. The identity of the maker rests entirely on a date. Move the date, and you move the maker. What's left is the wood itself. Shafts over 2 meters long, balanced in the front third, cut from the hardest part of a slow-grown spruce 3 to 5 kilometers from where 50 horses were killed and butchered. It's still fragile. Waterlogged wood that has held its shape for 2,000 centuries starts to fail the moment it dries out, so the spears now sit in a research museum in Schoningen under conditions someone has to maintain indefinitely. The lake is gone, the mine is closing. The horses are catalogued bone by bone in storage. And every conversation about the Stone Age that starts with the word simple runs straight into that shoreline and stops. The tapered point set off from the pith, the weight carried in the front third, the wood chosen by species and by which part of the trunk it came from. Whoever stood at that lake's edge wasn't making do with a stick. They were building to a specification in a workshop, from materials they'd gone out and selected 200,000 years before anyone wrote a word down.